In this video, I'm going to talk about specific types of pronouns. There are a variety of them in English, and we're going to start by talking about compound pronouns, which I'm certain you guys will have heard before. So compound pronouns basically means that what's happening is you're pairing another word with a pronoun using a conjunction, often and that's what creates the compound nature. And there are two cases just like there are with pronouns. So for instance, I might say, my mom and I, right? I would say I here because I'm using it as a subject. So that might be my mom and I went swimming. Ew. I can spell swimming appropriately. So my mom and I went swimming. Here, we have a compound set of pronouns. I could also say she and I, right? And I will put that up here so that way you can also see. So she and I went swimming. So this is going to be a little bit different than looking at the object case in pronouns in relationship to compound pronouns. So here is an illustration, and I'm going to use all pronouns so you can see. We, which is a subject pronoun case, found would be our verb, and I could say him and her at the park, right? Here I have compound pronouns, him and her. I'm not saying he and she, because here, instead of functioning like a subject, they're functioning like a direct object in a sentence. And so I need to use the object case. Now, this gets really interesting as we start looking at the difference between spoken and written language and start thinking about the difference between prescriptive and descriptive grammar. So the next question I have for you, is it correct to say than me? So let me give you an example. Um, they were taller, if I can write, or I should say spell correctly, than me. Is this sentence grammatically correct according to a prescriptivist view? Because I guarantee you this is the sentence that we would say, they were taller than me. Take a moment, figure out your answer, write it down. So, this is actually, right, commonly said, but technically incorrect. And I am going to show you why. What would actually be the kind of correct way of saying it is they were taller than and I'm going to put this in parentheses, was if we were finishing the sentence. And this is what is technically correct. That's why if you've ever heard anybody correct you and say than I, usually we don't use that subject pronoun when we're speaking. We would all say they were taller than me, they were taller than him, they were taller than her. We wouldn't say they were taller than he, they were taller than she. Than creates a comparison. So we want to compare one subject to the other subject. And so that's why we would say taller than I, because really we're using than to compare two complete sentences, right? They were taller than I was tall. They were taller, right, than she was tall. If we finish the sentence, it's gonna sound hella weird. But this is the difference between like linguistically what we speak versus grammatically what's expected. And so this is a really good illustration to look at like the difference between what we do versus what a prescriptivist might say. From a descriptivist perspective, saying they were taller than me, I understand what you're saying. It communicates, and I can explain, right, what each of the words are doing and why they communicate, which means that traditional correctness doesn't matter as much as communication. So, in a similar vein, I want to take a look at the me was construction, right? And by that, what I mean is saying something along the lines of me was, let's say, late. Okay, nice simple sentence. Um, I think, right, most people would assume that this should read, I was late. And in this, what we are looking at is an American English construction. Um, Me was late does something interesting. And it's kind of a part of what makes it interesting is that it has or like illustrates a history of kind of colonialist practices. So one of the things that linguists have come to kind of discover is that this construction relies on a word like me, which is the same as I, but in Jamaican Creole, which is a language that was influenced by colonialism in Jamaica, both from France and from England, right? So you have like the use of the English pronoun me, that comes to then impact a language. So in Jamaican Creole, me, is actually, right, a subject pronoun. And so then when we're looking at the history, for instance, of slavery in the US, where people were kidnapped, right, from Jamaica, enslaved, brought to the United States, that language, which already has a legacy of colonialism, comes with it. And so what you start to get then is this blend or these speech patterns that match with kind of traditional English patterns, but introduce words that are familiar to English, but in new ways because they've already gone through that colonial process. So if you remember back to talking about grammar myths, this is one of the reasons why it's really inaccurate to assume that the way somebody speaks is a marker or measure of effort or intelligence, because here these are actually like quite sophisticated constructions in that what you have, right, is somebody who's relying on those like patterns that were built into these older linguistic systems. So it does get quite interesting as you start looking into the history and the ways in which colonialism impacts the formation of language. And then what happens as you start looking at practices like the kidnapping and enslavement of people, and what that does in terms of transporting language across the globe. Demonstrative pronouns is up next. And these pronouns kind of very straightforward, like point, and I'll put point in scare quotes, to a thing. And I think that you'll understand what I mean by this in just a second. So proximal demonstrative pronouns just means pronouns that indicate something that's near, and that would be this and these, right? This screen, these ideas that I have, they're talking about things that are near, whereas demonstrative pronouns that are far would be that, right? Like that thing over there, or those, right? Those things far over on the other side. So they are a ways away. So when we're looking at demonstrative pronouns, they're like they point to kind of specific objects and they have to do with how near or how far they are. Now, these types of pronouns can be used as determiners. Okay. So for example, I could say that, right? Ugly cat, um, or this comfy blanket, right? Both of these are noun phrases. And so in these situations, both that and this are functioning like determiners in these noun phrases. Okay. The next type of pronouns I want to talk about are indefinite pronouns. And we use these quite frequently. They're words that often end with either one body or thing. Um, and as soon as I start, I think you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. So, anyone, anybody, anything, right? They're indefinite. They're referring to something, but it's not necessarily a specific something. Another example would be someone, somebody, right? Something. Okay. Um, everyone, everybody, right? Everything. Right? And you can kind of think about how this continues. We might say, for instance, no one, two separate words, nobody, right? Nothing. Okay. So all of these are indefinite pronouns. So the one buddy thing, is the way I would tell you to kind of think about that. In terms of gender agreement with indefinite pronouns, I'm going to come back to talking about the singular form of they. If I said anyone can learn if blank want to, what would you put in there? My guess is that you would probably say they, because it would be very cumbersome to say anyone can learn if he/she or she/he or she or he, right, want to. It's just much simpler to say they, which is why we tend to do it in speech. When we're dealing with indefinite pronouns, oftentimes we use the singular they pronoun, which is part of why it's become so prominent in terms of talking about gender neutrality, because it was something with language we were doing anyways. So if we say everyone can learn if they want to, if they put their minds to it. So useful, I think, to be aware of. So reflexive pronouns are what we'll talk about next, reflexive and reciprocal pronouns. The idea behind reflexive pronouns is that they literally reflect or refer back to a previous pronoun. Okay. Um, so for instance, if I were saying I, it would be myself, right? I myself believe, she herself, he himself, we ourselves, they themselves, or more frequently, themself, if you're using it in a gender neutral way. You would be yourself, and it would be its self. Okay. Um, so basically, in order to use a reflexive pronoun, the subject pronoun should appear earlier in the sentence. So I couldn't believe myself. She couldn't believe herself. You have to have that pronoun earlier in order for it to reflect back. Now, these are all reflexive pronouns because they're reflecting back. Reciprocal pronouns are a little bit different, but they are treated like reflexive pronouns. And these are each other and one another. Okay. And what all of these types of pronouns have in common is that they usually provide emphasis. Okay, so if we're thinking about why we use them rhetorically, and that means like what we're doing with them in language, we're usually using them for emphasis. Okay. Quantifiers are the next type of pronoun that I want to talk about, and these are pretty wonderfully simple because there are three main quantifiers that we have in English. And so that is going to be, I'm just going to number them so that way you can see both, many, and all. Okay. Um, and very simply, right, they quantify um and they often quantify nouns, right? So we might, for instance, say both of them. We have to have a prepositional phrase, but both is filling that role, right? Like of that main pronoun. We might say many books. Whereas here, many is filling the role of a determiner. We might say all um, of her ideas, right? Where once again, it's functioning like both does. So one of the things that's interesting about these is that they can function like pronouns. And sometimes they can also function like determiners when they precede a noun or a noun phrase. Okay. So this is pretty straightforward in this regard, but they are called quantifiers. The other types of pronouns that we're not going to talk about right now, we will talk about later on this semester, but I'll mention them now. The two other main types of pronouns are relative pronouns. So these would be pronouns like who, or which, right? There are more, but that's just a basic example. And the other type are interrogative pronouns. Okay. Um, and so we will look at these in later chapters. Interrogative pronouns are more often used with questions. So like what, right, is a good illustration. So as we start talking about like relative clauses later, and interrogative sentences, we'll come back to relative pronouns and interrogative pronouns.